Welcome to another episode of GUR Cafe. I'm your host, Lanie Dixon. I am very excited for today's episode and to be joined by the always lovely Sarah Romoslawski. Now, if you've been around games user research for a bit, you are very likely to know, or at least have seen a talk or two for that matter, from Sarah, as she has a whole wealth of experience both in games and out. As always, I had a great time sitting down and learning from her. As a little bit of a note for today's episode, we did experience some slight audio issues related to our internet connections, so please be patient with us. It's 2022, but we don't all have fiber internet, and I really enjoyed our conversation too much to scrap this one. We probably could have talked about a whole lot of different topics, but we hope you enjoy what we've got in store for you today. So, got a lot to chat about. Grab your favorite drink, and let's jump right into today's episode. Sarah, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here. Can you please introduce yourself to our lovely listeners?
Sure thing. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here as well. Thank you, Lainey. So, yeah, I'm Sarah, and I'm currently a staff researcher at Coinbase, and I'm focusing on research for their design system. And in the past, I've worked quite a bit in gaming. So, I've worked on, in the past, I worked on the Sifteo cubes, I worked on Pogo.com, and I also built a user research program at Glu Mobile. So right now, I think the way I think of it is that rather than focusing on like leveling up systems and gear systems and character design systems, I'm focusing on things like user research for error systems and things like that.
Which is still quite relevant. But I think that's what's interesting when we were kind of first chatting a little bit about this episode. I think that's what's really cool is you have this kind of shared experience of kind of games and then kind of, I guess, traditional user research, I dare say, I guess, kind of, which I think is really interesting. And I think that's going to be great for the topic that we wanted to discuss today, which is user research strategies for beginners. So, some relevant background information. I like to when I'm thinking about topics for podcasts, I like to think about kind of what's going on with my team. What are we working on? What are some of the struggles that we're having? And right now, we're talking a lot about building strategies. So, when I discuss building a user research strategy or a roadmap, this very often starts to feel overwhelming for our more kind of mid-level or junior researchers on my team because it's hard for them often to envision what a user research strategy should look like as opposed to what I like to refer to more as kind of like test strategies, these more kind of bite-sized um, segments of time, I guess, that they're often much more used to when they're on kind of a more junior level. But I like to start discussing thinking about building strategies with these folks to get them kind of in the habit of taking that step back, looking ahead to the future and thinking about where's our project going and how can we help them get there, basically, you know. And so many on my team that are progressing, they're leveling up their experience, and I want them to start learning more about thinking more strategically. So kind of outside of a single test or kind of outside the test room, if you will, if we were in person running tests, and really translating that into building a user research strategy, or at least thinking more strategically on their projects. So you gave a talk at Grux Online a few months back now, and the wheels in my brain have been spinning ever since, thinking a bit about strategy and how we can kind of build this, and maybe how we can condense it down a little bit for beginners. You know, where do we start? How do we turn this into something that feels a bit more manageable? So, Sarah, first things first, can you help me out? Start thinking a little bit about defining kind of what is a strategy kind of within the context of user research, kind of what are we talking about?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great summary. First, we have to just sort of think about like what is strategy and what is being strategic. And strategy in my mind is just, being informed on so that we have information to know what to do next. And For research, that could be informing what to do next on, what to build, like the whole product roadmap, like the whole suite of products that a company might be making, or a portfolio of games. But you can also ladder up and down when it comes to strategy, because it's also just maybe knowing what to do next for like your research plan, as you mentioned, or knowing what to do next for feature that even form a strategy for marketing. So, being strategic in your user research means that you are thinking about helping teams, making those informed decisions. So you want to, be really thinking ahead. It's sort of that chess game to make sure that teams can get the information they need to feel really confident in the designs and the decisions they're making.
Yeah, 100%. I like the chess analogy, but yeah, I think it is that kind of more longer term look, I guess. And I think sometimes I feel like people get a little bit scared, like, oh, strategy. It feels like this very kind of like daunting thing where it's like we're doing this on these kind of smaller bite-sized pieces with tests, and but it's more kind of thinking over the longer term, kind of where things are looking in the future. And I mean, but it's still very focused around a lot of the decision making and things like that that we do look at kind of on more short term. So while we were initially discussing the idea for this episode a couple weeks ago, you mentioned something that stuck out to me. And you said, just saying, I want to be more strategic. That's it. You're doing it. You're getting started already. And I think that's a really important kind of mindset shift that can occur is when you start to just like, okay, I want to be more strategic. And it's kind of like checking that little bit of that box because I think it can feel daunting. But I want to break it down even a little bit further. Because so, how can we start to think about being more strategic before we start thinking about building a formal strategy?
Sure. Yeah. I think we can start first by just saying, to ourselves, I want to do that strategic work. Like you said, it's just 50%. It's getting yourself 50% of the way. And then that sort of gives you the initial confidence and the call to action to perhaps, start talking to your stakeholders about, what's really important to them. Um, and it means that you can take that initial curiosity that you usually bring to, say, talking to your players, and bring that
Mhm.
to your stakeholders. And so that's sort of the first step. And you can, share with them, I want to build plans that can help you make informed decisions, beyond just, small changes, within the game that we're evaluating. And rather, I want to help you uncover, big insights that you could use, maybe down the road, and also perhaps you could use like forever. A lot of that kind of discovery and problem space work gives you insights that can be leveraged beyond just one single project. But it's really taking the time to listen to your stakeholders, like the people, like the game design team, the product managers, and your marketing team, and to just say, what's keeping you up at night? What are things that you sometimes think you're leaving to assumption that perhaps research could help you with, to innovate and make programs or new features that you feel more confident that the players are going to enjoy, that might cause more conversion and things like that.
Yeah, I love that sentiment of kind of like taking that curiosity that you use when you're having those interviews and kind of flipping it around, right? And I think that that's what I think is really interesting. It's like we all know this process of like digging through the why of questions when you're running that one-on-one interview with your player, right? And like turning that around and really kind of posing that back to the stakeholders to really try and understand, like, it's the same process, and thinking through, yeah, it's like you said, like, what's keeping you up at night? Like, what are the things that you're concerned or worried about, right? Even if you feel really confident in the general idea of the game that you're working on, they likely still have some questions or lingering doubts or concerns. And I like that idea of just kind of taking that curiosity and kind of just listening and being there and kind of maybe help drive that conversation.
Yeah, exactly. Because then you start to uncover those bigger research questions. You know, those things that your teammates and the people who are leveraging your insights are thinking about, or what's going to allow you to say, oh, now I sort of see that we're trying to, sort of uncover, motivations of players, or
Mhm.
learn, beyond just preferences for things. Really understand what makes for a really meaningful experience.
Yeah, and I think that it's what kind of allows us to be really successful in this space is that it lies really well with our skill set of kind of going in, asking questions, being able to sit with them and try and understand, okay, where are we going? What does that mean? And it's not just you as a researcher sitting in a room by yourself thinking, okay, I need to build a strategy. And
Right.
it's not
Yes.
just you kind of like, because I think that's where it gets really intimidating for a lot of people that it's like, well, where do I even start?
Totally. So I think that's a really good point. You're not building these strategies on your own. And I will say, I think the one of the things that was a game changer, when I was working in a previous role, was what caused the full, research team to just be more strategic. Really came, we innately wanted to do like more strategic work. Like, we just were like, hey, we can do work beyond just evaluative research. But what really was the catalyst was actually finance coming to us and saying, okay, like, no more of this, it's the middle of the year, you're asking for like this big budget for this project. Like, let's actually think and plan ahead. So it was the maturity, it wasn't just like the maturity of the research org was the catalyst, it was sort of the majority or the maturity of the business overall. And that was also just really validating too, to just be like, oh yeah, this is important work. It's important to take the time to talk to all of the teams we were supporting, and that's a necessary step to doing the work. And so that was really confidence building, because we knew, hey, this isn't just a need for us to be more strategic. This is a need for like the business, so that we can plan ahead. We can
Mhm.
ask for, headcount if we need it. We can say, oh, it looks like that, like a year, 6 months to a year from now, we might need to be doing a different kind of research. Therefore, we're going to need to kick off, finding a new vendor, like,
Mhm.
now rather than waiting, and therefore, not delivering insights in time. So that was really great. And so we worked with a lot with finance, even to sort of think, okay, at a high level, how do we, like, what is the sort of data we need, like the intel that we need to bring to them to say, this is the project, this is the budget. But to get to that high level view, you also have to really do the work to talk to the team.
Mhm.
And each team worked really differently. So, some teams kind of, some of the people we were working with wanted us to kind of like give them those questions of reflection, and then they kind of go and sit with them on their own and report back.
Mm, okay.
Whereas other teams were like, cool, like, let's like work on this together in real time. Let's talk it out over coffee. And so, you know, really what you just want to start with is, what's the plan? What are you making? Are there new audiences that, new player audiences? Is it not a whole new game? Is it like a sequel? Is it just a new feature? So you can start to work with them and think about that goal is, like looking 1 year out. I mean, probably it's not 5 years out, but it could be 5 years out. But
Yeah, very well, depending on the scope of what you're looking at, for sure.
yeah, it's just sort of that quarterly planning and like getting into that quarterly planning cycle that was super helpful for us. And we just hadn't yet. And then sort of that change really allowed us to say, look, these are the things that we know you need to know. Let's actually mark off an allotted period of time where we can do some stuff that's a little bit deeper. And doing that work also helps you to see, oh, it turns out there's like two teams that kind of have similar questions and maybe need to
Yes.
learn from similar people. So therefore, you're not just being strategic for like that particular team, saying, oh, I now can kind of like think, I can kind of like kill two birds with one stone. We can do work that's going to be relevant to like more than just one team, and we can like give those insights to them, and then you can put more time and more cycles into that strategic kind of work.
Yes. Okay, I love this. You said so many things that I wanna, like, double back on.
Okay, I said a lot. That was a lot. That's a lot.
No, I know, I'm gonna try and, like, catch all of the important parts 'cause my brain was, like, racing. Yeah, going back to, like, the finance thing, I think that's a really interesting way to kind of think about, like, okay, we gotta, like, figure something out here, right? And so
Right.
it's sometimes it's not even just the researchers being like, "All right, we're here. What do we do?" It's sometimes the team, like maybe if you're with a more mature, team that is very accustomed to having research, maybe they're trying to build out their finance plan and really trying to look at like, okay, we know we want research, but tell us what you want to do, or kind of trying to figure out, what are these kind of sparking points of saying like, okay, yeah, we need to start thinking about the research, but it's always really cool to think of all the different ways that those conversations can manifest. Like you don't I think for me,
Yes.
I wasn't initially when we came into this conversation, I wasn't thinking about it from like the finance angle, but I'm like, yes, of course, this makes total sense that finance would come and be like, "Okay, justify your existence. Like, why are you here? What are you doing?" And I'm sure this is something that's very familiar with a lot of people, and maybe on people that are smaller teams that have a much more lean research budget. They really have to start thinking, how do we maximize, right? And so when you were talking a bit about going into these conversations and being able to look at like, okay, I know you need answers and I know that you need some information here. I want to chat a little bit about that. Like if I'm a researcher and I'm going in and I'm sitting down with my design team and the producers and everybody there and trying to look at like what should I be looking for as thinking about like we should probably do some research here. Like is there anything that's like kind of stands out as being obvious of like those should be good times that research should be involved?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. So there's a lot of different ways to come at it. Um, I'd say, one way is to sort of listen for assumptions. So that's sort of it's like there's like the passive way, like when you're kind of just in the room. Then there's the active way, to uh, have those, initiate those conversations yourselves or yourself. Yeah. And so let's start with more of like the active way. Um, there's usually key moments like right in development cycles where you could say, oh, this is probably a time when I can make sure I have those conversations. Sometimes teams are really, really formal about it. They might be doing a whole full day offsite talking about their quarterly planning, and so
Yep.
you might know, okay, either I have the conversation for the offsite, and you could say, do we need to present our recommendations at the offsite? And sort of keeping in mind those quarterly milestones and sort of having, you can put time in the calendar and just say, hey, we're going to check in every quarter, every 3 months to know what's changed, what you're planning, um, and then you can have those conversations, and then start to listen and therefore make recommendations to say, well, if you need to be able to launch a feature at a certain date, then we need to work backwards from those goals, and then
Yes.
that's when you can start making the recommendations. You can really start building a plan, and you can say, well, it's not you. You actually don't want the insights when it's launching. You want it before, obviously.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think yeah, I feel like it's something that we did when I spent a lot of time working on Rainbow Six Siege, and we had new seasons that kicked off every 3 months. So, new seasons every year. And so we were all the research team, we were always anxiously awaiting the season kickoff. Talking about what was coming over the next season that was going to be kicking off in development, which was usually about, had a fair runway leading up, about a year or so. And, we weren't necessarily intimately involved in those conversations of like what was happening at the SKO with the season kickoff, but we got the presentations, or we could go to the presentation and just furiously writing notes of like, okay, so we know that there's going to be like this feature. Okay, we got to go talk to this team and like ask them what they need. And like, okay, it looks like it's going to be launching at this date. Okay, we got to make sure we're working in. And it was us kind of furiously taking all of the notes and then going out and doing kind of that field work of chatting with the teams, finding the product owners, like, okay, so we know that you're working on the new operator that's going to be coming out. Like, let's talk about timelines. Like, where are you at? How are things going? And we kind of worked our way backwards like that, like you were saying, really looking at, okay, so next year we know this feature is coming. So we kind of had our cheat sheet of all of the different things, and we could kind of just furiously run around the floor and find everybody that was working on things and be able to understand like, okay, this is your timeline. And so we could kind of start looking at the time and then kind of dropping those pins of, okay, if we've got a new character, then we need to be able to run some tests on their abilities, making sure we've got usability testings in there, and kind of dropping those things in. If we were asking really complex problems or they were designing a character, sometimes we would design, workshops with consultants to come in and talk with them about the authenticity factors and inclusion with the character design. And yeah, I think it's an easy way to kind of see, okay, this is kind of what's happening. If you're not actively involved, like you were saying, you can kind of get that on the back end.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and there's also just some very passive listening I think you can do as well. So, hopefully, I guess like too, like the hurdle too is to just, research needs to be in the room,
Yes.
at sort of, maybe leads meetings, or, weekly check-ins, but you can also just listen for assumptions.
Yeah.
And I'm lucky I'm on a team right now that has like weekly work sessions, and so I'm there in a lot of time just to listen, and see and say, oh, this might be an opportunity to test our assumptions. So you're just also listening for assumptions, and or sometimes we'll be in a room and people might make just like a blanket statement about a certain like subgroup of an audience. And so that might also be, a moment to say, hey, like, let's actually check our assumptions, and learn if that's true, because that could actually help us and inform, marketing strategy, especially if it's, around things like preferences or affinities to things.
Yes.
If we're always, making decisions based on assumptions, we might be making the wrong decisions. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love this kind of idea of that, being present is part of the strategy. It's like it's a very important piece to just kind of be there and absorbing how are they making decisions, who's making decisions, when does a decision need to be made. And that's when you can really start to kind of get what those questions are that are coming out. And I try and tell my researchers, just get involved in the weekly design. If there's a stand up meeting, or if there's weekly design syncs, or whatever those kind of recurring conversations are, And you don't have to prepare anything, right? Just because you're going to the meeting doesn't mean that you have to be the one that's doing any talking. Part of being a good researcher is just being able to be there and to listen and ask questions, not necessarily be the one to answer all of the questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think even being strategic, or like having a strategic research, or teams understand why that is.
Mhm.
And because they may need to just know like the sort of the nature of the role, and like why we tend to go to meetings, or certain meetings where we don't actually speak.
Yes.
And we're just listening. And maybe whereas other teams might be like understand that can also sort of communicating that. And so, and sort of researchers can even lean in and see, okay, well, maybe there's a bunch of meetings, getting to know a team, and you start with just like going to a lot of them, and you can always like dial it back. No one's
Yes,
going to be
100%.
like offended, but just sort of the reasoning for why we need to be there, so we can listen. Obviously, you can't attend all of them, so you wouldn't have time to do the research. But that is one way to just keep your finger on the pulse.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting way of kind of one, getting visibility for you as a researcher, getting visibility for research in general. But then also, yeah, like you said, kind of getting the information, trying to understand what the goal is, right? Because kind of going back to this idea of thinking about, okay, how do we build this more formal strategy? And yeah, it's what are we trying to do? What's the time, like what's the frame of time that we're looking at, right? Are we looking at for the next 3 months, 6 months, 1 year? What's the end point? And kind of trying to figure out, okay, we know where we need to end up at X point or X day. Um, what are all of the steps and kind of things that need to be done, right? Like, what are the decisions that the design team has to make? Do they need to be able to confirm, validate, like this specific feature is working so that they can move to the next piece, to the next piece, to the next piece? And so that can kind of cue you into, okay, this is their deadline. I'm going to make sure that I'm getting a test in X days or weeks or months before that point so that I can help them, because I see how important it is that they need to validate this specific feature before it gets into lock. And so I want to make sure that I'm involved early enough to be able to kind of help them make those decisions.
Totally, absolutely. Um, the other thing too, that when, because you might be putting a lot of thought into those plans, and working backwards from those goals, you'll also be able to see where hopefully you can fit in the kind of work that could be even higher level. And sort of what I mean by that is just that kind of discovery work where you're actually helping the teams kind of get out of their head, and go beyond the typical people they might be doing research with, and maybe doing a little bit of discovery, and to understand people like on a deeper level, that you could potentially, hopefully bring to those like brainstorm sessions. And so that research isn't just about like the evaluative um, questions, but research actually becomes part of the design process. And I think that's what
Yes.
researchers really crave. Um,
Yes.
but we also have to be listening, like as we're listening and as we're going to those meetings, we also sort of we can listen for those opportunities. And that also helps us know, oh, the team might be doing like a hackathon, and they might be doing like a game jam. And so if oh, the game jam is going to be like a month out, like wouldn't it be cool to maybe do like a little bit of problem space listening work with like an audience that the team's been super curious about, or on a concept, or like a topic that's really interesting. And then you could bring like insights back actually, and have those as lenses for the game jam.
Yes, I love this. Yeah, and this ties back into kind of some of the questions that were kind of kicking around in my brain when I was listening to your Grux Online talk, which for anybody listening, I will make sure that I link so that you can go check that out. But in that talk, you specifically were discussing 8 ways you can bring research strategy to your organization. And you detailed out a lot of interesting ones, but one of the ones that even when we were chatting a couple of weeks ago, we were talking a little bit about kind of like the number one thing, right? Like with discovery research and kind of building this listening practice and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about kind of exactly how that could look, right? You're talking about the game jam and thinking a bit about getting some information. Um, yeah, can you talk a little bit more about kind of what specific instances you would feel like, okay, yeah, this is the approach that I want to take and kind of how that might look?
For sure. Yeah. So this is something I've been thinking about a lot, and it's sort of related to this idea that in order to do really strategic work, and people who do like design strategy, obviously they're making these like artifacts. You might be making like a service blueprint. These are sort of like taking it outside of games. People are making personas, or designing these doing these big journey mapping projects. But in order to do that, you have to do a lot of work to get there. And you have to talk to a lot of people. You have to spend time to think really deeply. And I sort of see like those artifacts is like the way those kind of manifest in games. It's just, to me, that's the game itself. It's sort of thinking about the system, and thinking about the characters or the story. And that sort of tends to happen in this more creative space. The issue about games is games aren't necessarily utilitarian. So
Yep.
the kind of like problem space work, it's like, how do you like, what's the analog? But the value of just kind of having something like a user listening, what I'm calling a user listening practice, is that it's saying, okay, we're gonna just talk to people over time, and maybe we don't even know exactly what like the final end goal is, but we want to discover something and uncover something that we wouldn't be able to if we're not having these like conversations, because we want to sort of expand our horizons of understanding like an interesting topic. And I think like that topic could be sort of interest in food. It could be, costume, cosplay. Like there's all these like wonderful things. Games are a way for us to just, dive into the things that we're interested in, and sort of, immerse ourselves. And so like, why not immerse ourselves in it so that we can help other people be more immersed? But
Yeah.
I think sort of what we were talking about earlier, it's like it can sound really daunting. So it's like, oh my gosh,
Yes.
I have to schedule like, 10 people, 20 people, and I have to talk to them. And it's really time consuming. And also it can be exhausting. Like I love like user interviews, but it can be exhausting, right?
Oh
To
God,
to
yes.
talk to people. So
Yes.
rather than just saying, oh, we need to do this like in one fell swoop, you can sort of say, hey, let's spend like the next 3 months like talking to like a couple people a week, or even just one person a week. And then you sort of bring those things in, like bring those insights, those snippets of insight, and just sort of keep a running log of it. And then by the time you get to your game jam, you're just like, hey, here's all this stuff that we actually heard from people. It's not just from us, it's from a wide range of people. It then checks off other things for you too. It checks off hopefully inclusivity, and keeps, hopefully you're not just like bringing only your own biases to the game jam. So I think that could be a really interesting way to sort of prioritize discovery, this idea of discovery, and also like how to actually do it in a way that feels sustainable.
Yeah, I really like that because we've talked on previous episodes of the podcast kind of about like research as a design tool. And I feel like this can sometimes feel ambiguous. Like, what does that even mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do I even go about doing this? And like, this is a really excellent, like, somewhat time intensive but reasonably inexpensive way in which you can kind of bring new information to the table to really help inform the design. But yeah, maybe this is something that you're doing in between scheduled user tests or in between other evaluative research, right? Evaluative research has its value and has its place, and but it's really about finding those other opportunities. And again, yeah, looking at kind of the strategy of creating a more comprehensive look at the different problem spaces. And I think this is a really cool approach to kind of leveraging that. I think that is doesn't take a lot of fancy tools, doesn't take a lot of fancy
No,
resources.
right,
I mean,
right.
they help, right? But it's something that, even if you have a small team and you're feeling kind of like, okay, well, what can I do? Where do I begin? This is something that's reasonably approachable to be able to kind of bring different ideas or context to the design decisions, to those discussions around making these decisions, which I think is a really cool way to get that increased involvement and, yeah, move to a more comprehensive look than just the evaluative.
Right. And I think another thing that's cool is, typically, we want to recruit, participants, but um the, doing these kinds of like listening sessions, or just, talking to people about, their interests, and digging into those things. You can also do that with your coworkers, because you might have
Yes.
coworkers who like
Yeah.
love games, but they're not actually the developers. But this is also a way to coworkers, and make it so that everyone at the company is like a game developer. This is a way for you to just even build those bridges. And so if it feels like, oh, it's going to be really hard to recruit this I don't know, niche group of people, maybe start first doing these sort of ad hoc listening sessions with your teammates. Maybe like your teammates in finance, or your teammates in
Hmm.
HR. Maybe they're
Yes.
playing games, and it would be valuable to hear from them too.
Yeah, and I think, yes, I love that because I think it is something that we're Ubisoft. We're an enormous company, and especially here in Montreal, we have a lot of people, and so it's so nice to be able to just send out an email to the studio or send an email out to some people and be like, "Hey, can you come talk to us about this thing?" And because you just never know, yeah, your partners in HR, your partners in finance, facilities, IT, right? There's so many different groups of people, and everybody kind of has this shared passion, especially when you're working in games. Everyone's drawn to it, either whether or not they have that kind of label or of game developer or game designer. People are still very passionate about it, and you can learn so much by just, yeah, asking around people within your research lab, your research group, or outside of the research group. Yeah, I love that. I think it's such an interesting way of thinking about new types of research that you can build into your strategy, which I think is always really kind of nice to add that into your toolkit. So when we're thinking a bit about kind of building out your strategy, right? Any other kind of pieces of advice that you would provide for kind of those just trying to get started? Kind of what are some of the kind of the most important pieces they could include, or how to involve their partners more? Anything?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess you can talk a little bit about like, what does this even look like? Like, what does
Yes.
do like what happens? What are the actions? And like, I mean, this looks like spreadsheets. It looks like
Yes.
it looks like the budget, the cost, the things. That's sort of what's sort of happening, sort of the outcomes here. But sort of before you get that roadmap view, I mean, you're essentially trying to build, a roadmap and a plan. And and that can be in a spreadsheet, it can be in a fancy tool, like I guess like Asana or something,
Yeah.
but it can also just be in a spreadsheet. And then I think too, what you can do, there's another thing I love is in that there's a book called The User Research Team of One, and
Mm.
there's a table in that. It's like a book by Leah Bewley, I think. There's a table in there that says like learning plan. And I sort of see the learning plan as the first step that you need to take to get to that higher level view roadmap, because you essentially want to know, like, from your teammates, like what they're trying to move the needle on, right? They're like, okay, well, like the big goal this year is driving retention or something, or the big goal this year is to make sure players who are still playing our game um, stay engaged, and things like that. So, and then you can take the time to say, well, like, why is that? What you think might be causing people to disengage, and then you can actually build sort of the learning plan around, these are our beliefs, like we believe like people are motivated, and then you can say, well, how confident are we in our beliefs? And then you can say, okay, now we know, based on this like confidence analysis, we can sort of say, no, we have analytics here to back up these questions, but here we really need to do more digging. And that sort of helps you get sort of to the first step of like, okay, I think we need these projects, because you can look at the questions and say, oh, all right, I think in order to help survey, and maybe we need to do this. And then you sort of get sort of the low level view of like this learning plan by team. And then you can say, oh, it turns out like this one team kind of wants something similar as the other team. And then you can decide how you want to build your roadmap view to sort of show, hey, like this project might be impactful across multiple teams. So that's sort of like the things you're doing, like the things you're building, and then you're having meetings, you're going back to the team and saying, does this make sense? We talked about all these things, these are all the things you said you need to know, this is how I want to approach that. Do you agree? You're getting buy-in and alignment, and there's also ways you can do that collaboratively as well. But like
Mhm.
typically, the final step is like that roadmap sort of spreadsheet view.
Yeah, I love the learning plan, kind of starting it with it from there. I feel like that's a much more approachable, digestible way to think about, because you're like, okay, strategy. But it's
Right,
like, okay,
right.
well, what do we want to learn?
What do we want to learn? Yeah,
And I love that. I think it's such a nice way of kind of breaking it down, because it's easy to kind of go into that conversation with your designers or whomever and say like, okay, yeah, what do you want to learn? What's our
yes,
goal? What's our end point? And it feels a bit more digestible for people to be like, okay, yeah, this is what we were trying to do. And it's the same way I'm telling my team, like, what decisions do they need to make? Right? Like, what are the deliverables? What are the due dates? What's happening on those due dates? What's happening within those deliverables? What are they trying to accomplish? And yeah, to start kind of like unraveling back from that kind of endpoint to get to where you are today, and being able to think about, okay, this is where we want to end. This is what we want to learn. All these pieces that we want to learn, we're going to build out a project, whether that's some sort of evaluative test, a listening practice, whatever. We're going to put in all these different pieces of research to look at these specific learnings and how they build over time. And yeah, then going back and checking in with your partners and being able to explain to them, like, okay, this is what I've gathered from our conversations. This is what I feel like I can help you with. Does this make sense for you? Is this aligned with your timelines? And you can tweak, right? And just because you make that plan and you put it in an Excel spreadsheet doesn't mean that it just gets stored away somewhere. It can evolve and change, just like games are evolving and changing and chaos ensues and from time to time. It's flexible and you can,
Yes.
add things here or there, and you can maybe put in, 3 main kind of gates over the next few months, and then you have some downtime in between where you can think a little bit about like, okay, I'm going to give myself some free time these few weeks, and that's going to be my exploratory time. I'm going to go chat with the team, figure out what problem spaces they're kind of encountering, and maybe do some little kind of guerrilla ad hoc stuff and build that into your plan as well. It doesn't have to be every minute of every day, rigid,
Right, for
you know,
sure.
prescriptive plan.
Yeah, I think too, like you were sort of saying, like how you were talking a little bit about like making sense and sort of checking in and the pivoting. And I think you can always, at any point, I think anyone should feel confident that as a researcher, it's okay to always check in and say, I just want to double check, is this the problem we're solving? And this is the
Yes.
problem we're solving.
Yes.
And this is how we're going about solving the problem. And
There's your
I
strategy.
have to remind myself too to just be like, oh, wait, what is what is the problem we're solving?
Yeah.
And sometimes in games, it's not necessarily just like a problem, but if
The delivery. What are we
it's,
trying to deliver?
yeah,
And
you
it's a
always check
feature.
in. What's the
Yeah.
goal? Try to get that in writing, and have that be your North Star if possible, but know that the North Star can also change because as you're learning things, as you're working through the learning plan, you're gonna learn things. And sometimes that North Star moves a little bit in the sky.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a really kind of nice way for people to kind of start thinking about, okay, what types of questions should I be asking myself? What types of questions should I be asking, my partners and my stakeholders that I'm working with, and really kind of thinking about, okay, we'll start making that learning plan and start looking at kind of what questions they have and start thinking about what are the problem spaces, and like you said, like what's the problem, what are we trying to answer, what's our goal, what's the feature, when is it supposed to be done, and kind of keeping that kind of working backwards rather than always feeling like you just need to keep sprinting, right? It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a projection, right? Like we're going to try and do these things, but inevitably when everything goes wrong, we at least can have an idea of these problem spaces still probably have to be addressed, whether they get pushed 3 months or not. And so being able to kind of have that perspective to say, like, okay, here's how I could potentially approach these different problems, and kind of keeping that flexibility and thinking, yeah, like checking in. Is this still evaluating the problem that we thought we were trying to to answer?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, we're running close to the end of time, but do you have what other final pieces of advice do you have to share for those that are kind of trying to venture out into building a strategy of their own for their research project?
I mean, I say just, I'm the kind of person that's like, okay, I just need to try it.
Yeah.
Just get started talking to, talking more to your stakeholders and building relationships. That's something that it's a muscle you'll have to build, and we all continue to build and building relationships. And, and at the end of the day, being able to be strategic means that we have to understand the partners that we're working with. I think
Yes.
really the first place to start is to start talking and communicating to learn how to actually inform that plan. I'd say, start there and know that like you don't have to apply every strategic method or every user research methodology like right at once. And it's okay to just start with like sort of that communication and thinking about the plan first. And then over time, I think hopefully, the opportunity to try new things will organically come up. But I think sometimes as researchers we're like, oh my gosh, we have to like, we're like boiling the ocean. But it's okay to just, which I think we want to help everyone, we want to solve everyone's problems. But just sort of getting big picture view and starting there and just knowing like you already have, just I want everyone to know it's like you already have what it takes to be strategic and you already have the knowledge to make the recommendations. And so it's just
Mhm.
sort of like starting to practice that and building that plan first.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like you had a lot of really like helpful pieces of advice, especially for just getting started, because I know it can feel really scary to kind of start like, okay, I gotta like make some crazy presentation and this and that. And it's like, you just, it's just start asking these questions, start listening, start trying to just think a bit, take a step back, take a step out of the test room and start thinking a little bit about where are we trying to go. And yeah, we don't have to solve every single problem that needs to be solved, but really trying to evaluate, where's our the best bang for our buck that we can really leverage our expertise and be able to identify maybe some interesting opportunities. We were talking about the discovery, research, listening, and kind of different ways of in invigorating research into
Yes.
the the process of those that you're working with. I think is just it's a really powerful place to start. And it doesn't have to be anything overly complicated, even though sometimes it feels like it is, but it's really not. So, Sarah, thank you so much. I had a pleasure chatting with you. We've chatted about this for a bit, and I appreciate your perspective because you do have that kind of in games and kind of out of game experience. And this is something that you've spent a lot of time developing in the different roles that you've been in. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and joining me today.
So sure thing. This is amazing. It's amazing always to talk to you, Lainey. And
Thanks.
I feel super honored to be on your podcast, and I'm happy to talk about strategy anytime with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Everyone, if you have questions for Sarah or myself, please let us know. We'd be more than happy to continue the conversation and help you out when it comes to kind of thinking about building that strategy for the first time. So, Sarah, thank you so much. And we will see you all very soon.